The phenomenon of Thanksgiving, the three tables of gratitude, created by Red Cardinal Kitchen, the light of a living archive. To the keepers of light, to the nations who tended these lands long before foreign sails touched their shores. To the ancestors whose hands gathered corn, roasted game, built fires, and blessed the earth beneath their feet. To the strangers who met across storms, winters, and hunger, and still chose to share their food. To every table where gratitude is whispered, this story is yours. The table that remembers. Before nations argued over dates, before feasts were written into schoolbooks or parades filled November mornings, Thanksgiving lived as breath beside firelight. It rose wherever human beings survived something that could have ended them, storms that tore ships apart, winters that dimmed hope, hungers eased only because another hand shared knowledge or food. What we now call a holiday began as three small sparks in three distant places. Three circles of people who looked at land and sky and each other and whispered gratitude into the vastness. This is the story of those sparks, carried across centuries until they formed the warmth we still gather around today. The quiet seed of gratitude. Gratitude seldom begins with plenty. It begins with survival, with shaking hands, with cold bones remembering warmth, with hunger eased by mercy and loneliness eased by fellowship. It begins in the moments when breath itself feels borrowed. And so we step back, to frozen cliffs, to lantern-lit timber halls, to the autumn ground beneath an open sky, to watch the first seeds of Thanksgiving fall into the earth. A story for the keepers of light. For the nations who tended these lands long before foreign sails appeared on their horizons. For ancestors whose hands gathered corn and berries, roasted game over open fire, shaped clay pots, and blessed the soil beneath their feet. For strangers who met across storms and winters and hunger, and still chose to share what little they had. For every table, of stone, of plank, of woven mat, where someone has once whispered, "Thank you, that I am still here." Before Thanksgiving became a word pressed into November calendars, before parades marched and ovens filled with recipes passed down on folded cards, gratitude lived as something smaller and more fragile, a breath beside a fire. It rose wherever human beings survived something difficult together and could not bear to eat their next meal without acknowledging the mercy of it. It did not begin as a single feast, in a single place, with a single people. It began 3 times on this continent, 3 quiet circles in the north, in the east, and in the new fields of New England, each one leaving a footprint in the long journey of thanks. If you listen back through time, you can almost hear those footsteps, across frozen sea spray, through a timber hall glowing with lanterns, over autumn ground, where a fragile piece sits down to share a bowl. The first of these tables appeared in 1578, where the North Atlantic presses its cold breath against the rocks of Newfoundland. Martin Frobisher's English expedition had been sent out, under Queen Elizabeth I, searching for passage and promise through waters that felt nothing for either. There, the sea did not roll gently, it reared up like something alive. Waves rose in dark green walls, slamming into the oak hull until it shuddered. Icebergs drifted like pale, silent giants. Winds howled for days, tearing words from the mouths of praying sailors and flinging them uselessly into the storm. By the time the weather broke, the men were bruised, salt burned, and nearly out of strength. Dawn came thin and ashen over a broken horizon, showing them a coastline of stone and frost. Newfoundland, part of the ancient homelands of the Inuit and Beothuk, whose own fires had burned there for generations unseen by these newcomers. To the mariner's eyes, it looked harsh, stripped bare of comfort. There were no gentle fields, no sheltering trees, only cliff and rock and bitter wind. But after so many nights believing they would never see land again, even this severe shore looked like a miracle. They rowed to land in small boats, boots scraping on frozen earth. Some of them fell to their knees as soon as they stepped onto ground that did not move. Their bodies shook, partly from cold, partly from the sudden release of fear that had been locked behind their ribs for weeks. Here, in this place that did not know their names, they prepared to give thanks. Driftwood was scarce and damp, but they gathered it anyway, along with splintered timbers from their battered ships. 3 men cupped their hands around tinder and spark, trying to shield it from the hungry wind. When a flame finally caught and began to lick at the wood, it felt as though the world itself had exhaled. They fed it patiently until a small, steady fire burned against the gray. Their food was almost nothing. Hardtack, ship's biscuit so dense it could crack a tooth, was broken into pieces and softened with melted snow. Scraps of salted fish were warmed at the edge of the fire until they loosened. An iron pot, blackened by years of sea and smoke, hung over the flame with a scant handful of dried peas simmering into a thin, pale broth. Melted snow served as water. There were no herbs, no sweeteners, nothing added simply for pleasure. Everything served one purpose: to keep them alive. They had no table to set. The earth itself was their table. Some sat on rocks polished smooth by ages of wind and sea. Others lowered themselves to the frozen ground, backs to the wreckage of barrels and spars. The pot was passed from hand to hand. Steam rose from tin cups and wooden spoons, fogging the air in small ghosts of warmth. When bellies were at least given something to hold, the men lowered their heads. There was no priest with a book that day, only human beings who understood that they were breathing on borrowed time. One voice, rough and hesitant, broke the silence: for deliverance from storm and deep waters. Another added, for the land beneath our feet. Another, eyes closed, whispered, for breath restored. And together, like a rope braided from many fragile strands, the words joined: we give thee thanks. That was the first recorded Thanksgiving on this continent. No feast, no music, no great spread of dishes. Just a circle of men on ancient stone, stunned to still be alive. Gratitude measured not by how much was on the fire, but by the simple fact that they were there to eat it at all. That was the first table of gratitude. Years later and further south along the coast, another table was set, this time inside wooden walls, under a roof that creaked and sighed beneath heavy snow. It was the settlement of Port Royal in Nova Scotia, in 1606, on the ancestral lands of the Micmac people. Here the enemy was not an immediate storm, but a long season. Winter did not come and go quickly. It settled over the settlement like a weight, stretching the nights and thinning patience and hope. The French settlers missed the green fields and stone churches of home. The forests around them were deep and full of unfamiliar sounds. Some mornings the cold seemed to press right through their wool and into their spirits, freezing their laughter before it reached their mouths. Champlain watched this quiet erosion of heart and knew that hunger of the spirit could be as dangerous as hunger of the body. So he created a practice, l'ordre de bon temps, the order of good cheer. It was, on the surface, a rotation of meals and hosts. Beneath that, it was a deliberate tending of joy. In the timber hall they had built, heavy beams crossed overhead like the ribs of a great wooden beast. On nights of good cheer, lanterns were lit and hung from those beams, dropping warm circles of light onto the long plank table below. The great hearth burned hot. On spits turning slowly in front of the flames, geese and ducks roasted, their skins browning and blistering. Fat dripped into the fire with small hisses and flares, filling the room with the smell of roasting meat. Iron kettles hung over coals, thick stews bubbling within, onions, turnips, carrots, and any roots they had managed to store, softened and seasoned as well as their supplies allowed. Coarse bread, baked in clay ovens or directly against heated stones, emerged with darkened crusts that crackled when torn. The air was heavy with smoke, meat, and the promise of something more than endurance. Then the Micmac entered. They did not come as curiosities to be watched from a distance, nor as servants to stand along the walls. They came as invited guests. They brought their own foods, drawn from a land they knew intimately. Fish from rivers that still steamed faintly in the cold, their silver bodies laid carefully on wooden platters. Game from the forest wrapped in leaves and seasoned with wild herbs. Corn dried in braids, then ground or boiled into warm porridge. berries preserved in sweetness against the long winter, shellfish from the tidal flats, cleaned and ready for the pot. These dishes were added to the table, roasted birds glistening in the firelight, kettles of stew opened to send up fragrant clouds, bowls of corn porridge steaming, bread stacked at either end, berries catching the lantern light like small jewels. The table itself became a bridge of wood and food, connecting people who had not always seen each other clearly. Before they began to eat, a Micmac elder rose. His hands moved gently as he spoke, his voice carrying the weight of a people who had always known this land and its rhythms. The words were later translated and recorded in the language of the settlers, but their spirit was older than ink. We thank the Creator for water and fire, for the wind that carries stories, for food shared among friends, and for life that continues. A hush followed, then the soft murmur of French voices offering their own gratitude, each in their own way. Somewhere among them, someone surely gave thanks simply for the sound of laughter returning to the hall. The doors may have rattled in their frames as the winter wind pushed at them, but inside, for that night, warmth held. This was Thanksgiving as fellowship. Not a single desperate meal on frozen stone, but an intentional gathering where despair was kept at bay by the sharing of food and story. It was a table where two peoples, settlers and Micmac, sat together long enough for fear to loosen its grip. That was the second table of gratitude, and it lives in the memory of what would come to be known as Canada's first Thanksgiving. A third table would be remembered most often, though often told with details rearranged and softened into myth. It stood, not indoors this time, but under an open sky, in 1621, at Plymouth, in the homeland of the Wampanoag nation. Here, too, winter had nearly broken a people. The pilgrims who arrived on the Mayflower carried religious conviction and fragile hope, but little understanding of the land. Their first winter was brutal. Disease and hunger claimed nearly half their number. Graves appeared in the cold earth faster than they knew how to fill them with words. The woods and marshes around them were not empty. They were part of a living world, the world of the Wampanoag, whose language, wisdom, and relationship to the land the pilgrims did not yet recognize. The story could have ended there. It did not, because the Wampanoag chose to teach. Under the leadership of Massasoit, and with the help of Squanto, who had survived kidnapping, enslavement, and the long journey back to his homeland, they showed the pilgrims how to plant corn in mounds, with fish placed beneath to feed the soil. They taught them to plant beans that climbed the corn and squash that spread across the ground, leaves shading and protecting the soil, the three sisters, growing together in mutual support. They taught them where to fish and gather, which plants could heal and which could harm, how to read the seasons of this particular sky. When harvest came, it was not bountiful by modern standards, but it was more than the pilgrims had believed they would ever see in that first year. Ears of corn stood in their fields. Squash and pumpkins lay on the ground. The memory of winter's empty nights stood beside these full rows and made them seem larger than they were. Wanting to mark this survival, and to honor the relationship that had made it possible, the pilgrims prepared a harvest gathering. Massasoit came with about 90 Wampanoag men. They brought 5 deer, carried on their shoulders, and likely other foods from their own stores: roots, herbs, berries, corn. The pilgrims added what they had learned to prepare: waterfowl roasted on spits, duck and goose, perhaps some wild turkey among them, pots of corn mush thickening over the fire, beans stewed with whatever herbs and fat they had, squash and pumpkins roasted whole in embers until their flesh turned soft and sweet without sugar, fish from local waters, clams and mussels gathered from the tides and steamed in pits lined with heated stones. The meal was rich in variety, but simple in tools and presentation. There were no crystal goblets or fine linens. Instead, wooden planks were laid across upturned barrels to form makeshift tables. Where planks ran out, woven mats of reeds were spread on the ground, and baskets, clay pots, and wooden bowls were set there. Fires ringed the gathering, their light blending with the last light of autumn day. Smoke curled upward in fine threads that looked, to anyone watching closely, like prayers unspooling. Before they ate, the pilgrims bowed their heads. In an English shaped by their faith and their suffering, they gave thanks. We thank thee, Lord, for the breath within us, for the earth that yields, for the hands that taught us, for the mercy that spared us, for the food before us. Let this table hold peace as long as we draw breath. The Wampanoag's thanksgiving was not written down in the same way, but it was present in the very structure of the day, in the sharing of deer, in the readiness to sit and eat together, in the patience of teaching skills that had saved lives. For 3 days, the two communities shared food, space, and stories. The world did not become perfect. History after that moment would hold great sorrow and injustice. But for those 3 days, there was a real, breathing thing between them. A fragile bridge of shared need, shared food, and shared gratitude. From these 3 tables, the sailors' circle on frozen stone, the Port Royal Hall lit by lanterns, and the Plymouth clearing beneath autumn sky, the ember of Thanksgiving was carried forward. For a long time, it wandered. Families held their own days of thanks after surviving storms or illness. Churches named days to acknowledge good harvests or deliverance from disaster. Different communities, native and non-native, paused in their own ways to breathe and say, "We made it through this season." It would be many years before the young United States tried to gather these scattered embers into one national flame. In 1789, George Washington, the first president of the new republic, proclaimed a national day of Thanksgiving. The Revolutionary War had ended, the Constitution had been adopted, the country was fragile, its future uncertain. Washington asked the people to set aside a day, to be devoted by the people of these states to the service of that great and glorious being, giving thanks for protection and favor. It was a single day, not yet an annual pattern, but it marked an important turn. Gratitude for survival and beginnings written into public life. Decades and trials later, in 1863, the nation stood inside another kind of storm. The Civil War tore states, families, and hearts apart. Fields became battlefields. The land itself seemed to groan under the weight of all that had happened upon it. Abraham Lincoln, seeing this unraveling, reached again for the thread of Thanksgiving. In the midst of war, he issued a proclamation making the last Thursday of November, a day of thanksgiving and praise, to be kept every year. He asked people not to pretend the suffering did not exist, but to set beside it an acknowledgement of what still remained: harvest, endurance, hope. In the darkest season of the nation's story, he tried to anchor one day to the practice of gratitude. By the 20th century, Thanksgiving was widely celebrated, but its date was not entirely fixed in law. In 1939, with the Great Depression still shaping people's lives, Franklin D. Roosevelt shifted the holiday 1 week earlier, hoping to extend the shopping season and help the struggling economy. The change caused confusion. Some states adopted the new date, others returned to the traditional one. For a time, people joked about Republican Thanksgiving and Democratic Thanksgiving, but under the humor lay a question: when, exactly, do we do this together? In 1941, seeking clarity and unity, Congress passed a joint resolution, and Roosevelt signed it. Thanksgiving would be observed on the 4th Thursday of November. The day finally found its permanent home on the national calendar. But it is important to remember, neither Washington nor Lincoln nor Roosevelt created Thanksgiving. They gave shape and schedule to something humanity was already doing, on cold stone, in timber halls, around rough outdoor tables assembled from planks and barrels and woven mats. They wrote into law what people had already written with their breath. We are still here, let us eat together and be grateful. If you could see all 3 original tables at once, you might picture them as 3 panels of a single painting. On one side, a handful of sailors huddled around a small fire on the edge of the world, iron pots steaming in the grip of Arctic wind. In the middle, a long wooden table in a rough-hewn hall, lanterns glowing, Micmac and French settlers sharing stew and bread while the snow piles up outside. On the other side, an autumn clearing where Wampanoag and Pilgrims sit and stand around ancient tables and brown mats, venison and red cardinal kitchen, the light of a living archive.